So welcome to the webinar on how to jumpstart your political campaign. I am Julie Polakovich-Carr. I'm a city council member in Rockville, Maryland, where I'm serving my second term. If you're not familiar with Rockville, we're actually the third largest municipality in Maryland, and last year we were the fastest growing city in the state. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I was exactly in your situation, which was I was trying to decide whether or not to run for office for the first time. It's a big decision. There's a lot to think about. I sought the advice of a lot of people. And basically, fast forward to today, I want to pay it forward in a way and help other progressive candidates who are thinking about throwing their hat into the political arena to make this big decision and hopefully to get more involved in politics by serving as an elected or an appointed official. So in tonight's webinar, we're going to cover 3 topics, basically considerations for before you decide to run for office. And then if you do make that decision to go ahead, what are some of the first things that you should consider doing to get your campaign off the ground? And then lastly, a few of the mistakes that are commonly seen in candidates running for all levels of office. There should be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I will just say from a housekeeping perspective, if you have any questions that come up throughout the presentation, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A box. I won't actually be actively looking at those as we go through the presentation, but they'll be there waiting for me when we do get to the time for questions at the end of the formal presentation. On the other hand, if you're having any technical difficulties, I would encourage you to use the chat function. My husband, Eric, is serving as the host for tonight's webinar, and you can feel free to send him a private message if you're having issues with anything, and he'll be able to communicate one-on-one with you about those issues. And I see he just sent a message to everyone in chat. So let's get started here. So what are some of the questions that you should be asking yourself or considering before you make the decision to run? I do want to say just from the get-go that some of these questions are going to be harder to answer than others, and that's okay. Hopefully it's not going to stress you out too much to maybe not have answers tonight or even tomorrow on some of these things, but just know that you're in good company. I think anyone who runs for office realizes the amount of work and sometimes the uphill battle that it can be. So these questions aren't meant to discourage you whatsoever, but really just to help you make an informed decision about whether or not this is the right decision for you and for your family and your community. So let's jump right in. The first question to ask yourself is, why are you running? What motivates you? Are there certain issues that you're interested in or things that you hope to change? I actually got my start in politics because I was really concerned about environmental issues. There were actually some local issues around stormwater management in my own community that initially got me involved with the municipal government. But for other people, there's other issues out there. You want to see more affordable housing or increased funding for public transportation. Or it could be because you're really frustrated with the incumbent who's currently serving in a particular position and you think somebody else could do better. Starting to think about these questions and answering these questions not only is going to help you jumpstart the messaging for your own campaign, but hopefully help you decide what office is the right fit for you. For instance, let's go back to the affordable housing example. If that's something you're really concerned about, perhaps in your area, your municipal government or city government doesn't have land use authority or zoning authority, but say the county council does. That might help make a difference in terms of what office that you're actually considering running for. So that leads us to question number 2. What office should you run for? Of course, there's really different dynamics at play if you are running for a seat where there's a vacancy versus a seat that's held by an incumbent. Vacancies tend to attract a wider field of candidates, and it can be more competitive in a way for vacancies, but it also leads to different dynamics in a race. If you're running it against an incumbent, being a likable, capable person with good ideas may not be enough to unseat that person. You probably will need to draw more of a contrast between yourself and the incumbent. That doesn't necessarily running a really negative or nasty campaign, but really painting a very vivid picture for voters about what you would do differently than the person who's currently holding the seat. I would be remiss as a local elected official to not talk about the potential for making progressive changes at lower levels of government, at the city or the school board level, or even non-elected positions, such as appointed positions like Planning Commission, Board of Elections, Board of Appeals. Many jurisdictions have these citizen advisory groups, which are selected by, say, the city council or the county council, or even at the state levels. And these can be great ways to push for reform in your area around a particular issue, like election reform, or smart growth or other issues. It's also a great way to kind of have a long run or the long view on your own political career, to be, say, building your own resume, and to start building a farm team in your area. So before you even think about running for elected office, trying to get one of these appointed positions, so that ultimately you're setting yourself up with having this longer track record of involvement in your community. So I mentioned that these lower level offices can be a great way to actually push for progressive changes. And I found that that's been my own experience on the city council. We deal with everything from affordable housing to bicyclist and pedestrian safety, smart growth, public transportation. And right now I'm leading the charge around a so-called sanctuary city policy to make sure that our local law enforcement isn't co-opted into enforcing federal immigration laws. Where you can and where you might feel like it's appropriate, I would encourage you to talk to people who maybe currently or in the past held the office that you're considering running for, just to get a better sense of what the job actually entails. If you can maybe even shadow the person in their position, that's actually a great opportunity if you're thinking about bodies where there are multiple people who serve, for instance, like a board of education or city council or county council. You might know someone there who'd be friendly and let you shadow them for a day and get a better sense of what the job is actually like. So we'll move into a few more personal type questions. So the first one to think about is whether or not your partner is supportive. Besides the candidate, in many ways, your partner, if you have one, may be the next most important person on the campaign. They're going to do a lot in terms of boosting your mood and helping to just keep your household running, maybe even providing childcare and a home cooked meal when you need one after a long day of being out on the campaign trail. But oftentimes these people are really great volunteers for your campaign. For instance, my husband was probably my biggest volunteer in terms of door knocking in both of my elections. I've known other people where their spouse was really integral in terms of doing fundraising or helping to recruit new volunteers. So that's a really important person to make sure that you have on board who is going to be supportive of things moving ahead. On a related note, it's good to have your employer on board as well. Most candidates are not going to have the luxury of not working a full-time job while they're campaigning, because we need the income. And that may even be the case after you're elected. There are many elected positions out there that are not full-time positions, where the meetings happen in the evenings, and a lot of the obligations are kind of on flexible time. So it's worth having a frank discussion with your supervisor or even people above that, whether or not this is going to work out for you. Some other considerations are you may need to save up some vacation time. There may be times, especially later in the campaign, when you'll need to have some time to take off for debates that might happen during your work day, or certainly on election day, so that you can be at the polls all day. I also found it was very useful that my employer allowed me to work a little bit more flexible hours, kind of outside the regular 9 to 5 hours when I was campaigning. I went in a little bit earlier in the morning, and then that way I could get home a little bit earlier and actually start door knocking on weeknights after work while it was still light out, and get 2 or even 3 hours of knocking in, especially in the summertime, on a weeknight. And that was really helpful. There are sometimes other cases where you need to be concerned about conflicts of interest between what your current job is and what issues you might be working on when you're an elected official. I've especially seen this for folks who are, say, attorneys, where they were working on cases that then were related to the business that was before the body that they sat on. So you may need to make some shifts in your portfolio at work. And I think that's about it on this one. So question number 5, how much time are you willing to give? I realize this is one of those questions that might be a little bit anxiety provoking, and you might start to worry here about, oh, can I really do this? Campaigning really is more of a marathon than a sprint. It really is about not just what you do today and tomorrow, but the day after and the day after that. So it's important to think about, how can you make this fit into your life, and into your family life, and into your need to work and to make money too. So for a lot of candidates, the big time sinks are going to be voter outreach, whether that's doing door knocking or phone calls, and then fundraising. So you're somewhat constrained in terms of when those things can happen, because of course you need to do door knocking during daylight hours, and phone calls, you're not going to be calling people at 11 o'clock at night. So having time in your evenings, especially on your weekends, is going to be important. For instance, when I campaigned, I tried to work on my campaign every day. I knocked on doors Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursdays in the evenings after work. Monday evenings were council meetings, although when I ran the first time and wasn't yet on the council, I knocked on Monday nights too. And then I always tried to keep Friday evenings free, just so I had a little bit of a break each week, and tried to keep that evening free of campaign stuff. And then on the weekends, I would usually knock for 5 or 6 hours on Saturdays and Sundays in the afternoons. It's important to have goals for how much money you're going to raise each week, and for how many doors you're going to hit, or how many calls you'll make in a given week, and to try to stay on track with that. And so kind of blocking out time and having a predictable schedule in terms of what you'll do with your campaign can make it easier to achieve those goals. It probably works out to at least 20 hours a week for campaigning. That can really vary though. There'll certainly be times that are busier when you're trying to get your mailer, your first piece of mail designed, where you're going to have to crunch it and get some things done. There might be weeks that are a little bit lighter. Another consideration, because I am a parent, I realize how tough this is when you have kids. When I ran for re-election, my son was just a few months old. So when the weather wasn't too hot, he got to come out door knocking with me. But I realize that's tough. And I've known other people who run for all levels of offices with kids at varying ages. And believe me, there probably is never a good time to run, especially when you have children. But so that's why I said at the beginning that this is a bit of a tougher question to answer, but it really is worth thinking about now about how you could maybe make this work. So back into some more logistical type questions. What's the filing deadline? This is pretty important, because you want to make sure that you actually have enough time to run a viable campaign, and to actually, one, fulfill all the requirements that you need to get onto the ballot, but two, actually to run a great campaign before Election Day. I know that some folks who registered for tonight's webinar are looking at races in 2017, but most of you are looking at races that are in future years. I would say, the longer that you can give yourself to prepare, the better. That doesn't mean you actually need to publicly announce, very soon if you're looking at a race for 2018 or 2019. But there are things that you can be doing in the meantime, before you have that campaign kickoff event and put out the press release and all those sorts of things, to help yourself prepare. Everything from doing one-on-one meetings with community leaders, potential donors and supporters, going getting a cup of coffee with folks who might be influential in your community. Those are really helpful things to do. You can start building databases of potential supporters and volunteers, and we'll talk a bit about that later in the presentation. Doing research on the issues, even doing, say, a driving tour of the district, all those sorts of things are things that you can do early on. But you just want to make sure that you're giving yourself the time to actually run that good campaign. So the next question, what do you need to do to get on the ballot? In many jurisdictions, you'll need to collect signatures from registered voters from the district that you're running in. That's going to vary, of course, by jurisdiction and by office, what you actually will need to do. It might be as few as 100 signatures, say. It could be more than that. It could be a percentage of the voter turnout from the last election. It really is just going to vary. You'll likely need to complete a small mountain of paperwork, which may include registering a campaign committee. Often that will mean that you will already need to have created a bank account for your campaign. And then the last point I'll just highlight is that depending on the jurisdiction, you may actually need to have already filled a couple campaign positions, maybe treasurer and maybe less likely campaign manager. This doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have paid staff for those positions. I did not have any paid staff on my campaigns. It was all volunteer, but I did have someone who was designated as my treasurer and someone who's designated as my campaign manager, and they were the people who were put on the paperwork there. Those roles certainly can change later on in your campaign, but you may need to update the paperwork that's on file with the jurisdiction. All right, number 8, how much money do you need to raise? I would suggest looking at the campaign finance reports for the last 3 election cycles for the race that you're actually looking at. So if you're looking at running for state delegate, look at what people spent on state delegate races in your district the last 3 state level elections. And you can actually average what the winners spent to get a good sense of what you need to budget for. Now, if the winners in each of those cases was an incumbent, that you may need to add a little bit of buffer there and go a little bit higher than what that person spent. Incumbents have the advantage of good name recognition, so they may not need to spend quite as much money as someone who is new and doesn't have that name recognition or is actually trying to unseat an incumbent. Having a little bit larger war chest is going to be helpful there. It's also worth noting that this information should be publicly available. Of course, it's going to vary jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Some states have online databases that are searchable, and you can just go on the website and see it. In other cases, you may need to go to a website and say download PDF copies of the report, but that information should all be out there and you should be able to look at that. Another point that's worth raising is, to the extent that you can, try to find out what people are already spending in the current election cycle. Now, there may not actually be answers out there on that, because depending on the filing deadlines for campaign finance reports, sometimes there are large windows of time between when those reports are due. For instance, it may only be on an annual basis at this point. If you're, more than a year out from an election, especially if you're looking at a 2018 or 2019 election. But sometimes people will report things to the press, so it's worth seeing what other people who are in the race have already raised so far, if you can find any information there. So related to that, it's worth starting to think about who is going to give you money. I'll say that for a first-time candidate, it is not unusual to have friends and family members and people that you personally know represent a sizable portion of your donations, even if those people don't live in the area where you're running. They might be from out of state or something like that. But it can be a great way to get a campaign off the ground, even if these are small donations. Asking your aunts and your cousins and friends from college for $50 or $100, that can really add up. So it's worth actually coming up with a list or an Excel spreadsheet and writing down the names of every person that you can ask for some money and how much you're going to ask them for. And we'll talk about fundraising in another portion of the presentation tonight, and go into a little bit more details about generating that list. In addition to the list of people that you already know, or names of people that you might ask for money, You might also think about categories of people who might give you money. So this might be people who have concerns around particular issues, like say environmentalists. This might be based on demographic information, say senior citizens, or even geographic information like people in your neighborhood. But in general, it's probably going to be harder to raise money from other groups of people that you don't already have personal connections to. But it's still worth going after that. All right, number 10. How many voters do you need to actually do outreach to? I promise this is the only slide that requires math, but it does require a little bit of math. So basically, you're going to need to calculate something that's called a win number. And this number is basically the number of votes that you need to get in order to win your race. And this number is really influential in terms of a number of other decisions in your campaign. Everything from how many voters you need to try to contact through canvassing or calling, the number of volunteers you're going to need to recruit to do that voter outreach, how much money you'll need to fundraise, because it'll determine how many mailers you need to send out, those sorts of things. So there's really only 3 inputs to this, calculating this number. The first one is the number of registered voters, and you multiply that by the average turnout, and then you multiply that by 0.52. So let's break that down. So the first bit, the number of registered voters, is the number of people who are currently registered to vote in your jurisdiction or your district. I'll note that if the race you're looking at has a primary, especially say a closed primary where only Democrats, registered Democrats, can vote in the Democratic primary, then you want to look at the number of currently registered Democratic voters. If it is a race where there is not a partisan primary, then it would be all voters regardless of party affiliation. Then you multiply that number by the average turnout from the previous 3 races. And like before, when we were talking about fundraising, you just want to look at comparable races. So, federal elections are very different from state elections that are different from municipal elections that are held in different years. So if you're running for a county council race, you want to look at the average turnout for the last 3 times that the county council positions were on the ballot. And then lastly, you're multiplying that by 0.52, as in 52%, because you need a majority to win if this is a one winner takes all type of election, and you'd like to have a little bit of padding. So rather than just planning for 50%, you're going to plan for 52%. So the math is a little bit different and a little bit harder to figure out if you are running in a race where, say, it's the top 3 candidates win or the top 4 candidates win, as may be the case in an at-large seat for a city or county council. But this still gives you the basic sense of what information you need. So the last 2 questions involve a little bit more soul searching. The first one being, are you comfortable talking to people? Running for office involves a lot of asks for people to asking for them to vote for you, asking for them to give money, or giving their time to support your campaign. And that can seem really hard. To be perfectly honest, I am a bit of an introvert, and when I was first thinking about running, that seemed awful to me, the prospect of having to ask all these people for things. And especially having to go door knocking and to have to talk to literally thousands of people and going and knocking on their door and talking to them about myself and then asking them to vote for me. But I actually found that I got into a bit of a groove once I started knocking, that after a few dozen doors, it got a lot easier. And it actually got to the point where I really liked door knocking. And after my first race was over, I actually really missed canvassing. I had found it incredibly valuable and a great way to hear insights about the community and to hear what was on people's minds that weren't necessarily the perspectives that you would hear from the people who actually take the time to go to City Hall or to write into City Hall. But it is important, if you are an introvert like I am, to find a way to recharge your batteries, because it can be very draining talking to all these people for hours a day, day after day, week after week. So just make sure that you're, finding things to do and giving yourself that time so that you are refreshed to go back out and to keep talking to folks. And the last one here, hate to end on kind of a downer note, but think what it would mean to you if you did lose. Most people are not going to jump into a race thinking that they're going to lose. But what would it mean for you if you did? On one hand, there are lots of folks who do lose their first election or even their second election, and then they go on to win in a subsequent race, whether for that position or for something else. In some cases, it actually can be a strategy for increasing your name recognition for those later future elections. I've personally known some people who ran for office, and it was tough on election night. They were pretty upset about it, but they quickly realized that it was okay because they knew that they had given everything that they could to the campaign. They left it all out in the field, so to speak, and they gave it their all. And so the fact that they lost, it was okay because it's not like they had held anything back. And in some cases, I've heard people say that they felt like even though they lost, that they set a great example for their children by showing how to be involved in their community and how to run a race with integrity. So we're going to move on now to the second phase here, which is hopefully, you're going to decide that you do want to run for office and you found a position that seems like it's going to be a good fit for you. So how do you actually jumpstart your campaign? We're going to go through a short list of things that you can do and should prioritize for the beginning of your campaign. This clearly is not meant to be an exhaustive list of things that you'll need to do. So the first one I'll highlight is filling key roles. There are lots of roles in a campaign that need to be filled, but at the beginning, I would say prioritize these three: campaign manager, treasurer, and kitchen cabinet. These are probably the most central figures in your campaign, and whether you fill them with volunteers or with paid staff, they're the ones that you should be prioritizing for earlier on. So campaign managers is probably the person you'll work most closely with. They are going to help you develop your campaign strategy, messaging, and actually execute that plan. Oftentimes campaign managers are going to help with fundraising or with door knocking or calling voters. I'll say that advice that I've been given, although I don't have any personal experience in this, is that a spouse or a partner does not make for a good campaign manager. Usually leads to lots of fights. In my case, I actually had a close friend who had an interest in politics who served as my campaign manager, and that seemed to work out pretty well. Your treasurer, as you might expect, is going to handle the financial parts of your campaign. It's really important that this person has a good attention to detail and is really going to be a stickler for following the rules, knowing the rules and regulations, and keeping track of every last cent that you bring in and that your campaign spends. And then lastly, the kitchen cabinet, so to speak, are your advisors. That will also be helping with, figuring out strategy, messaging, but these should also be people who are going to do things for your campaign, not just talking about these things, but actually helping to raise money, helping to recruit other volunteers. So before your campaign gets off the ground or before it becomes public, I suggest that you take some time to tackle some things that might become a problem or cause you some worry or concern down the road. First of all, if you are not up to date on your taxes, make sure that you are and that you're fully in compliance there, because that would be a pretty negative story if that's not the case. You probably want to take a critical eye and a critical look over all your social media accounts, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of them, and remove or make private any content that might not look so good to a potential voter who might be perusing your profiles there. We already talked about the importance of talking to your employer and making the appropriate arrangements there, and ensuring that you are going to have the time and the flexibility that you may need as your campaign wears on or once you get elected. And lastly, I would suggest that you take some time now to update your resume and then also to prepare a biographical sketch. These will be documents that you'll end up using, especially the bio sketch, on your campaign website, but you may also need to provide these documents to press or to groups that might be doing endorsements, things like that. So the question of why are you running? I know we started the webinar in the earlier section with that question, but we're going to come back to it because it's probably the hardest question that you'll have to answer in the course of your campaign. It's a deceptively simple question, but the way that you answer it really says a lot about who you are as a person, who you are as a candidate, and what you hope to do once you're in office and what you'll do for the community. So really take a lot of time to come up with a good answer to that question. And I would actually suggest that you have some friends or family members who ambush you periodically with the question of, why are you running? And that way you can practice it and make sure you have your talking points down, but that you can answer the question in a way where it sounds natural and not like something you've memorized. The next tip is to write your campaign plan. And this actually means write down a document. Don't just talk these issues through, but have something on paper or in the cloud or wherever that you and the key members of your campaign can go back and revisit it. So there are some great resources online that talk about what should be in a campaign plan, but I'll just highlight that you're going to be making some important decisions about strategy and potentially even messaging as part of this plan. Everything from the size of your voter universe, which is related to the win number that we talked about calculating earlier. How you're going to do your outreach to voters. Are you going to do calling or are you going to do knocking? The size of your campaign budget, a rough breakdown of how you plan to spend that budget. For instance, roughly how much for, say, yard signs versus mailers, versus a campaign website, those sorts of things. You may even start to figure out how many volunteers you're going to need to recruit. Again, that'll relate back to what methods you plan to do outreach to voters with, as well as some other issues. So a campaign plan really should be seen as something that can be flexible, that it should be updated and change and evolve over the course of the campaign, but it is worth starting out with a plan and not just kind of going free form as things go on. I do want to mention here, since I mentioned about calling versus doing in-person canvassing of voters, just a few considerations there. Because I know we have people on this webinar who live in all parts of the country and probably urban areas, suburban areas, rural areas. So in general, if you live in a typical suburban area, you probably doing canvassing or in-person door knocking is going to be your best bet. If there are single family homes or townhouses on kind of a residential street, you're going to be able to walk that. When you start to think about rural or urban areas, though, there are some other considerations where calling voters might start to win out. Calling has its own problems because it's often hard to find accurate phone numbers for voters, and oftentimes you're going to have to spend some extra money to get those phone numbers. But if you're somewhere where the houses are just simply spaced too far apart to be able to walk between voters' houses, especially in rural areas, then calling's going to be a better bet. In the urban environment, on the other hand, and even in parts of the suburban environment, if there are a lot of, say, high-rise apartment buildings or condo buildings, oftentimes the entrances to those buildings are locked. And very few jurisdictions actually have provisions to allow for political candidates to get into those buildings. The state of Minnesota has actually been pretty progressive on that issue, but in most cases, as a candidate, you're just kind of out of luck, and you don't have a way to get into the building to actually go knock on those doors. So unless you can get creative and maybe find people who live in a large apartment complex who are willing to host a house party or something like that, your only other way to reach those voters is through direct mail or through calling. So just a few considerations there for you. Make sure you do your research on election laws and regulations. It's really important that you and the key people in your campaign, meaning your treasurer and your campaign manager, have all read those laws and regulations before you start collecting any money, before you start spending any money. Very likely when you access the candidate packet from the relevant jurisdiction, they will include a copy of those laws and regulations. If they don't, make sure you read them online. It's also important to note that these laws can really differ at different levels of government. For instance, the state of Maryland has their own laws for folks who are running for state level offices, like the state legislature, whereas each municipality in Maryland has its own elections code. So someone running for the city council has a different set of rules that they have to follow than, say, a state level or county level candidate. So just make sure you're looking at the right information. Fundraising. I promised we were going to come back to this issue. It's really important to come up with this detailed list of people who may actually give money to you or who may support your campaign in another way, like with volunteer time or an endorsement. So you literally need to go through your phone and through your email accounts and your social media accounts and write down this list or type up this list of people who might be willing to help you. And by every name, write down a goal of how much money you're going to ask them to donate to you. And you're going to be pretty exhaustive with this. Friends, family, coworkers, neighbors, people you know from extracurricular activities, people you went to school with, the parents of your child's classmates, if you send them a holiday card, all of those types of people. And again, whether or not they live in the area, whether or not they are able to vote for you, you're still going to ask them for their support. In addition to this group, it is also worth thinking about who are the key players in your area. You may not be asking them for money, but activists, union leaders, neighborhood leaders, politicians at other levels of government, to see if they might endorse you or do something else that could be helpful for you, or even just give you advice. A lot of people like to be asked for advice. So these ideas of doing these one-on-one meetings over coffee or something like that can be a great way to reach out to folks like that. All right, so we'll change gears here and we'll talk about some of the most common mistakes that candidates make. So the first one is not starting your campaign early enough. I said it before, but it's worth repeating that a campaign really is a marathon, not a sprint. It takes time to figure out how you're going to run your race and what you're going to do, and then to actually execute on that plan. For instance, the voter outreach takes a lot of time. Whether you're doing door knocking or calling, that is going to be a big portion of the time that you spend and that your campaign spends. In a typical area, you can assume that a candidate or a volunteer can reach about 20 doors an hour. So if you're running in a place where you need to reach out to 10,000 voters, that's 500 hours just of door knocking. That doesn't include your time for fundraising, for prepping to get out the door, for designing your literature, or any of those other things. The other point that I'll note is that fundraising takes time, and you need to plan on raising most of your money by at least 2 months before the election. So if the election is in November, usually the rule of thumb is that you've raised about 3/4 of your money by Labor Day. Now, you're raising all that money and you're setting it aside because you're going to spend most of it in those last 2 months of the election. Another common mistake is talking to the wrong people. There's actually one reason why I'm not a huge fan of going to community events, like fairs or festivals or things like that, as a way of talking to voters, because a lot of times there are people there who don't live in your district, so they can't vote for you. Or they do live in your district, but they aren't registered to vote, and you don't have a way of knowing that when you're just talking to people. They might say they live in your town, but you don't know whether or not they're registered to vote. And then there's a big group of people who are registered to vote, but they don't actually vote. So the advantage of doing calls or of door knocking is that you can sort through all of that data and actually just come up with your list of people that live in your area, they're registered to vote, and you can actually see what their voting history is. not who they voted for, say, but what elections they have voted in. So you know which people actually show up for, say, a municipal election that happens in an odd year like 2017, or which people actually vote in the Democratic primary for state level elections, because it's a pretty small subset of all registered voters. It's also worth noting that there are just going to be people out there who aren't persuadable. With your voter outreach efforts, you're trying to reach people who you, one, think are very likely to vote and who may vote for you, or two, people who maybe don't have quite as good of a track record in terms of actually showing up to vote, but who would be very likely to vote for you for whatever reason. So this last group, it's harder to see, like you don't just know that from the data, but it's worth noting that you know, not everyone's going to be persuadable. Another common mistake is misusing time. In many ways, time is the one of the most precious resources on a campaign. So candidates really should be spending their time either fundraising or talking to voters, whether that's canvassing or doing phone calls. And everything else in your campaign, you should try to delegate it to someone else. So don't spend your time, you know, entering data into spreadsheets or trying to organize volunteer shifts or personally delivering yard signs. I will say I'm guilty of all of those at times in my own campaign. But to the extent that you can find someone else to do that, you should. Because in many cases, volunteers are much more likely to want to do tasks like that than they will be to want to go out canvassing. That's actually really hard to find people who are willing to do that for you. So another common mistake is spending money on things that aren't actually going to convince people to vote for you or to get them to the polls. So a lot of the typical campaign swag that you'll start once you declare that you're running and that's out there publicly, you'll start getting all these solicitations from vendors who want to sell you t-shirts or campaign buttons or little knick-knack giveaway things. They're a waste of money. Those are not going to help you win your race. Yard signs are also an area where you don't want to put a lot of money into them. There's a few schools of thoughts on yard signs. Personally, I think having some yard signs is worthwhile, particularly if you can get them in the yards of people who might be influential in their neighborhood or who live on a street where there's enough traffic or things like that. But you don't want to be spending thousands and thousands of dollars on yard signs. Come up with what your budget for yard signs is, shop around for the best deal, and stick to that. Consultants are also an area where this one's going to vary a little bit depending on your overall campaign budget. But in general, if your campaign is $25,000 or less, maybe even $50,000 or less, you probably are not going to need consultants, especially if you don't have any paid campaign staff. Then you definitely don't need consultants to tell you things that you likely already know. There actually was a candidate who ran in my area a couple years ago who spent 5 times as much money as the other candidates in that race, almost entirely his own money, and he spent it on consultants from out of state, and he still lost the race. So kind of a cautionary tale there. So try to keep the money back for the things that actually are going to matter in terms of voter outreach, whether that's paying for canvassers or paying for calls, or more likely direct mail, especially for smaller budget races. The vast majority of your budget is going to go into postcards and direct mail. And the last mistake I'll highlight here is not following through. Campaigns are really about the day in and day out hard work, and not just having one great debate performance or having some slick mailers. And the more that you can put that hard work in over time and have some real grit and determination, even when it's hot out or when it's raining or the football game's on or you're just tired and you don't feel like going canvassing again, being able to push through that is really what's going to set you apart and set you apart from your competitors. So with that, we will go to Q&A. And I see we already have some questions lined up in the queue here. Okay, just give me one moment here. So one question was, is it possible to win a race without paid staff? Yes, definitely. As I just was mentioning, especially if you are running in a race that perhaps is not as high of a budget, you know, for a lot of municipal level races or even state delegate races, you're talking $50,000 or less. So it largely is going to be about finding some good volunteers and some core people who will be part of your team and to help you with these issues and to help you with your race. But yeah, definitely doable. So another question was, how important is the role of money? How much do you have to go out of the way of traditional campaigning to have enough funds? Fundraising is really important. It's one of those things where you need to raise enough money so that you are a viable candidate and so that you can compete with other people. But there does get to be an extent where it's not necessarily the person who spends the most money who wins. There's lots of examples out there of all levels of races where people spent, you know, very large sums of money, far more than their competitors, and they still didn't win. So it's about raising enough that you have the sufficient funds to actually follow through on what your campaign plan is, to send out the number of mailers that you're going to need to send out. You know, for many races, you're not going to be doing things like advertising or TV or radio or anything like that, unless it's probably a, you know, a order of magnitude higher race in terms of hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent or something like that. So Seth asked, how important is it to have some experience as a worker before running for office? That's a great question. And I presume this means in terms of volunteering or working on another campaign before you run for the first time. I actually did not have that much experience on other campaigns before I ran. I had volunteered with some congressional, like presidential campaigns, you know, one-off type of things a few times during different campaign cycles, but hadn't had in-depth experience. But I did try to recruit then some people to advise me, especially my first race, who knew more about running at the municipal level and who had those insights, including someone who had run for office and was actually a current office holder. So, you know, if you don't have that experience, try to fill out your kitchen cabinet with people who do have that experience. Actually, I think that leads into another question here. You know, what do you think of nonprofit organizations like Ready to Run or Emerge? There are some great candidate training programs that are out there. I actually had done one that doesn't exist anymore, but Progressive Majority used to have an online training program for their farm team is what they called it. And they were online training webinars that they did for people for across the country. But there definitely are some other ones where you can go for a day or sometimes multi-day types of training in different parts of the country. Sometimes there's local groups that are cropping up and doing those. Those are absolutely worth doing. They'll get more into the details of, you know, specifically figuring out, okay, who are you going to target for your voter universe and helping to drill down on some of these topics that we raised tonight. So another question was, how high profile is your position? Does it affect your personal life? That's a great question. At the municipal level, I would say it's actually pretty funny. When I was canvassing and I would be sending out my mailers, you know, in the weeks leading up to the election, I felt like that was the one time every few years where I was a little bit of a celebrity in town because people would actually recognize me at the grocery store or on the subway or things like that. But pretty quickly, people forget your face again. I think that's true even for people who are in the state legislature, or maybe even on county council in some areas, or school board, et cetera, et cetera. It's not so much about the extent that I'm in the press or anything like that, but I would say that there is a personal impact just because of the workload and trying to make everything fit into 24 hours a day between doing city council work. I have a son, I'm married, I also have a day job because city council here is not full-time work. And so that's kind of the tougher part of it all. So a question about calculating voter turnout. How do you calculate turnout when all recent prior races were not contested and turnout was low? Yeah, that's a great question, and I probably don't have a good answer for that one, because if you're talking where only one person ran, it could be incredibly different. I think in general, turnout is pretty bad in a lot of areas. In those cases, you might just look at some other races that were held in other years. I said don't do that in general, but just to get a sense of where there were contested races, was turnout much different? Just to have a sense there, since the data that you have is probably not going to be that useful. Sorry, I don't have a great answer for that one. So a question about what did you do to build your resume before running? I think it's really important where people, again, have the luxury of time and are looking at elections that are further out to try to find opportunities in the community to help raise their profile and to maybe start making some strategic connections with other people. So I actually had volunteered and was appointed to an environmental advisory group here in Rockville, and had served a couple of terms on there. And then also had volunteered for some other community input types of things around development, and one was on city finances. And I actually tried to push myself to get involved in some areas that weren't necessarily things I was just fundamentally cared about, like for instance city finances, as a way to get some experience and to learn some new things. And by that point I was starting to think about running, and I thought, okay, well, this could be a good opportunity to get to know some people who are involved in a different issue, outside of the environmental issues that I had been involved in to that point. So a question about social media and using that to reach voters. That is probably going to vary a lot candidate by candidate. Social media absolutely is a viable way of doing outreach to voters, but it has some of the same problems that like going to a community event does. In that, although say on Facebook you can target ads or messages to people who live in your city, you don't know whether or not they're registered to vote, or even if they are registered to vote, if they have a history of voting. That's kind of one of the downsides. But in general, I think social media is a useful tool. Voters are very individual in terms of where they like to get their information from about a candidate. Meeting a candidate in person and getting to talk to them is probably the most valuable interaction for a voter in terms of making their decision. But some people like to look at the direct mail. Some people like to go on a campaign website. Some people like to go to debates. Some people like to look at social media. So the extent that you can do a little bit with social media to help promote your campaign and to promote issues that you care about, it's useful. I'll be honest, and this is maybe a little bit embarrassing given that I'm in my early 30s, but when I ran in 2013, I didn't have a Facebook account. I didn't really care about being on social media to that point. I still largely only use it for political or policy purposes even today. So if you're somebody who doesn't love doing social media, I don't think it means that you need to be on there posting 5 times a day. I'd say during the campaigns, I tried to post a few things a week that seemed relevant, or a picture, or even just saying I was out at some event, something like that. What's the best way to develop a script or talking points to use when canvassing or phone calls? There are, again, some great resources online that you can use to develop this. In general, just know that when you go and knock on a door, your interaction with the voter is going to be pretty short. First of all, most people don't answer their doors. And the people who do answer will probably listen to you for 30 seconds, maybe a minute tops, before they're going to lose interest and say thank you and send you on your way. So you need to have something that's pretty tight and pretty crisp that says who you are and why you're running, and just expect that most of those interactions are going to be, you're going to get off your little script, you're going to hand them your campaign literature, and they're going to say thank you, and that's going to be the end of it. There definitely are people who are going to want to talk and ask you some questions, and sometimes you'll get stuck at a door for an hour with somebody who's wanting to talk about all kinds of things, even if they're not related to the race. But really, it is important just to have something that's going to be pretty short. So I'll answer just a few logistical questions here about whether or not this presentation is going to be available afterwards. Yes, we are recording it, and we will be sharing a link with all of you and everyone else who registered but maybe didn't get on tonight, so that you can access it again in the future. A follow-up question about writing a campaign budget and writing a campaign plan. Wellstone is actually a good resource. I know they have a few documents on there, and I think they may even have like a template for a campaign plan that you can download as a good starting place to actually figure out what needs to be in those kinds of documents. A question about technology. Have you used Vote Builder? If so, do you recommend it? So there are products that are out there on the market that can help you manage, especially your voter outreach plans. They all have their pros and cons. Some of them are like NGP Van. I'm actually struggling to remember if Vote Builder is NGP Van's product. Are really powerful but pretty expensive to use. But there are some things out there. There are also some simpler things in terms of canvassing apps. I personally just know that a lot of candidates end up relying on spreadsheets and paper to stay organized, which also has its downsides. But if anybody wants to follow up with me after the webinar, I'd be happy to chat about some of those other products that are out there. And I have my email address there on the screen. So we'll wait here a second and see if any other questions come in. Realize we're getting to the hour mark here. I'm happy to take a few more. Looks like we got one more. How important was knocking on doors for your campaign? So voter outreach really is integral. So if you're not door knocking, you need to be calling voters, and whether that's you personally or volunteers on your campaign, but making sure that you are getting that personal connection with voters. As I mentioned a couple of questions ago, that is really key for voters making a decision about you. And it's going to be much more memorable to them than a mailer that they receive or a postcard they receive in the mail or something like that. So figuring out what the right universe of people is to talk to, and then actually following through and knocking on all of those doors and setting that time aside is going to be real important. And I don't see any other questions coming in. So I think with that, we will conclude for tonight. Thank you all for being on the webinar. Thank you all for your interest in running. I think it's so great that there's a strong interest of people who are thinking about running for the first time or maybe throwing their hats back in the ring. This is the type of thing that actually makes changes in America. And I wish you all the best of luck. And please reach out if there's anything I can do to be helpful. Have a great night, everybody.